Welcome everyone to today's webinar. The year so far, a recap session, which is part of the SDAS Stata 17 webinar series. My name is David and I'm one of the team here at Survey Design. And I'm joined here today by Laura. Welcome, Laura. Laura, what we've got for everyone today is a high-level recap session on the different webinars that we've covered over the last 12 months. Our agenda for today is covering the items in our webinar series. We're going to have a look at an introduction to graphs. We're going to cover an introduction to tables, a bit on data management, a little bit on data frames and how to use them, a quick introduction on automation and what you missed out on if you missed the automation and the loops presentations, and also two sessions that we're going to cover, one on Stata programs and one that we haven't done yet, which is dialog boxes. So then, Laura, we're going to do a brief recap on introduction to graphs. The graphs webinar was actually one of my favorites, and because I really liked being able to visualize graphs. So some of the things that we covered in that webinar was the purpose of graphs. So why would someone draw a graph in Stata, Laura?
So just generally speaking, when you're making any kind of visualization, what are you making it for? And there's sort of two main sort of buckets that sort of falls into. Is it for presentation purposes? So you're just trying to present some information. It could just be, a nice little line graph that shows the way the ASX 200 has moved in the past, 10 years, that kind of thing. That's really just a presentation of information. Or you can also do diagnostic graphs. So these are where you're using the graph to look at a model or another type of analysis that you've done and work out how accurate that model is, whether or not it fits with your assumptions about it, and just generally, how useful is that model. So one example might be if you've just run a regression model, you pull out the residuals and you graph the residuals. And if the residuals are not in what's considered to be a normal distribution, if they're skewed left or right, or one side has a really long tail, then you've essentially violated the assumption of a normal regression model, which is that your residuals will be normally distributed. And that basically invalidates the model. So if they're not normally distributed, it means there's not really any inference that you can get from the model that you've run. So you sort of want to check to make sure residuals in the normal distribution so that you then know that your model is accurate and you can make inferences from it.
So there's really those two primary purposes. Presentation, which everyone knows about because we see graphs every single day. But if you're an analyst and you've done something, you probably do want to be running these diagnostic plots just to check whether or not your data or your analysis is right. And I know Stata has a whole bunch of these built into it, like the AV plot and the RVF plot, which is the residual versus fitted plot. So Laura, where can we get some information on these post-estimation graphs?
So if you're just looking for like normal standard regression, it's just help regress post-estimation. And you can do that with any type of model. Just help the name of the model command and then the word post-estimation. It will pull up all of the diagnostics that you can run.
Okay, that's useful to know. Then we've got a bunch of other types of graphs that are just readily available in Stata. So there's the two-way plot, which is a scatter plot where you're trying to plot a variable against another variable.
Yeah, and they go from really, really simple where it's just X versus Y all the way up to layering of two-way plots so that you might have a scatter underneath with a predicted plot over the top, things like that.
Yeah, they can become quite complicated. And one of the great things that I like about the two-way plots in Stata is you can do a plot on top of a plot, on top of a plot, on top of a plot. So you've actually got many different things plotted within the one graph. Then probably the most simplest one that Stata is able to do is the histogram, which is showing you your frequency. But by default, it actually shows density, doesn't it?
Yes, I find frequency more intuitive to kind of understand. Density doesn't really make sense to me just on a basic level. So I like to do frequency instead. And it's just, you just put a comma after you do your histogram variable name, comma, and then the word frequency. And it will do it in frequency instead of density.
Yeah, so instead of just writing histogram and then the name of the variable, you put histogram, the name of the variable, comma, frequency.
Yep. Yeah. I just find that more intuitive.
Yep. And then pie charts. Now, I don't think I've ever drawn a pie chart in Stata.
Yep, I've drawn them. It's really just another way of displaying a categorical histogram. So you can run a histogram on continuous or categorical variables, but the pie chart is just for categorical variables. So it's just basically a different way of visualizing it if you prefer circles.
Right. So we could actually do a pie chart on the auto data set.
You could, yep. So you can do a pie chart on the repair record and you'll get 5 different pie pieces.
Okay, I must try that one. Then the box plot, and I actually did some box plots the other day, Laura.
Yeah, so box plots are really great for getting a visual understanding of the distribution of certain variables. They're really great there. So you can do your summarize command where you're just looking at summary statistics, which will tell you, the mean and the min and the max. But I always find it more useful just to really look at that visually and see the outliers and the distribution of variables that way.
Yeah. Then Stata's got the bar chart, which is simply a plotting of the value, single one.
Yeah, so it can be values. There's also a whole bunch of statistics. So like you could plot the means of a bunch of different variables, or you could plot median or minimum, maximum values, that kind of thing. Any kind of statistic you can plot on a bar chart as well.
Okay. Now, and then the contour plot. Now, I know we have some of these out on our Tech Tips site on how to do contour plots, but this is, again, one that I haven't done.
No, so the only time I've used contour plots is when I was trying to do something very specific with sections of colors, but it's more of like a map, like a heat.
I know we have one out on Tech Tips. It's in English and also in Mandarin. We have that one out there. And then in our webinar that we ran for this, we also gave some advice on adding additional options to each of the graphs. Yeah.
So just some simple options. But my top tip for this really is just that when you're trying to learn graph commands and graph options, do it through the menus first. And you'll really start to get a handle on what all the options are, what things you can give them just by doing it through the menus. And a lot of the graph options are applicable to pretty much any type of graph that you run. So once you've learned it in one graph, you can apply it to most others.
And then I know we have a video on this, and we've done a presentation how to do advanced graphics using the graph editor. But what you're talking about there using the basic options or appending options is using the dialog boxes when you create the graph commands rather than using the graph editor.
Yeah, so when you create the full graph command, you just use your regular graph menu, and then you'll get a printout in the history pane, which has the full command, and it will have all of the options applied there too, so you can kind of learn their names and things if you like sort of typing them out. My main suggestion there, though, is you find yourself always changing one option every single time you run a graph. At that point, it's probably a good idea for you to look into schemes and making your own scheme. Because you can actually create a scheme that you apply, which means every graph, for example, if you want all your graphs to have a nice clean white background, you can make a scheme, and it means any graph you run in Stata will have a white background applied to it.
Laura, I think it's probably about time that we run that graph presentation, that graph webinar again, and also do the one that we ran on how to really customize your graphs using the graph editor. Our next one that we covered was on tables. Now, Stata added a whole lot of stuff on tables in Stata 17. They've added a table builder, and they've provided methods on how to collect data using these commands.
Yeah, So table was actually there already. They just kind of modified it, but they did add another command called collect, which basically allows you to create a table from almost any command that you'll run in Stata. If it gives return results, you can make a table with those return results. So it's really, really powerful.
Right. So that's the collect command.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then they also added these features for presenting data in a table. And so our webinar that we've done on that shows you how you can really tweak individual components of a table and make it ready to export to Excel or Word or PDF or even HTML with all of those features that you've prepared within Stata. So it's not like you have to go and tweak it again in those other products. You can do it programmatically within Stata.
Yeah, and you can also, sort of example, if you're making like a Word document, they've added a new command called put docs collect, and I believe there's also one for put PDF as well, put PDF collect, I believe, which will add the table as it is to the current put docs or put PDF document that you're building in Stata. And this essentially allows you to do two things. You can incorporate it if you've got a big long report that's made entirely with put docs or put PDF. You can incorporate that table really, really easily into that. But you can also use it to append to other documents. So if you open up a put docs document and then apply the table to it, when you save that put docs document, you can actually save it to an existing document and it will just append it to the bottom.
So it doesn't have to be the put docs document that you're working on right now. You can specify. Then we did a webinar on data management. The reason we decided to do this one is Stata is such an important tool for data management. Often when you get a data set, it's not going to be clean. It's probably got numeric data saved as strings. It probably have records in the wrong place. If it's anything like some data I looked at the other day, it had individual records spread across multiple lines or individual observations embedded within multiple lines, which was absolutely confusing. But data management is really important in Stata. And so the webinar that we ran then was emphasizing 5 different things. And that was collecting your data correctly the first time round. So if you've got control of being able to collect your data, specify to the people who are collecting it how you want it collected for your purpose. Then you need to go through and find any errors. And you need to work out what an error is.
Yeah,
what actually constitutes an error?
This is really interesting because it's really a lot more than just missing data. I think when people think about finding errors, they're thinking about finding a string in a set of numbers or something really obvious like that. But it can be more insidious. If you've got, so for example, someone's collecting a bunch of ages of people and they input the data and they accidentally sort of fat finger it and end up with an age that instead of 24 is 240. Well, that's an error, but it's not necessarily going to be immediately obvious to you when you're looking at that variable. It's got numbers in them. The numbers seem broadly correct when you're looking at them. You're not necessarily going to know that there's someone in there who's clearly 140 years older than they possibly could be. And so Stata has a whole bunch of tools that actually really allow you to look at errors in the sense that they're improbable or impossible. It's not possible for them to be true, therefore it's an error.
Similarly, I know in that webinar, I think we ran one where you had a 90-year-old who was in 5th grade at school. Yeah. And so 90 is not an unreasonable age, and so you could include that in your sample, but is it appropriate that you've got a 90-year-old in 5th grade at school? Probably unlikely. Yeah. So it's all that sort of thing. So it's not just looking at the individual variables, it's cross-tabulating where you would expect to see values linked up. If things look a bit funny like that, then you want to be able to find those. And then once you've found those problems, you've got to fix them. Yeah, and you've got to have a strategy for fixing them. How are you actually going to handle them? And an interesting one you mentioned there is missing data. With missing data, your data set may have a bunch of missing information, but if you give it to someone else, they may look at it and say, actually that's perfect. It's exactly what I want. Or vice versa. It may be everything that they need, but when you look at it, you go, oh, it's missing a whole bunch of data. Because it depends on what the analysis that you're trying to do as to whether or not you've got missing data. But as long as you've got a strategy for cleaning up that data, and Stata can help you with that. Stata can help you clean that data. And then one of the things I like is even if you use the data editor in Stata, it's going to log the change that you made. So you know exactly what you've changed it to, and you know that you changed this individual record. Another key part of Stata is defining and explaining your data. So you can assign labels and assign notes to individual variables. And this is a powerful way of helping you manage your data, keeping your data clean, and making sure that when you share your data set with someone, they understand the information that's in the data set.
Yeah, so Stata provides a bunch of different ways of labeling your data just to really make sure that you've included all the information that needs to be there. So it's not just the name of your variable is going to be a very short, word or maybe 2 words, but then your label can really go into the descriptives of it. And you can then use notes on a variable as well to say this variable, the information of this variable was collected in this manner. These were the dates that it was collected on, just really expanding on making sure that you're giving as much information as you possibly can about the data in your data set.
And then the other feature of Stata is its ability to collate and combine and merge data.
Yeah, so sometimes or oftentimes you're given data. So you're given a bunch of data, and it can be in multiple different formats. It can be spread across multiple files. It's quite common to end up with an Excel spreadsheet with about 10 different sheets, all with slightly different data that all kind of match up in different ways. And so just being able to pull them all in together into one data set is really, really useful.
And this, Laura, this is actually a good segue into our next section that we covered, which is about frames. I was doing some analysis the other day, and I actually found the use of frames in helping me manage to clean the data up. Using frames was really important. So I was able to segment out components of the data, put it in a separate frame, and then merge it back in or connect it when I needed to be able to create the files. So frames are a key part of data management. So let's have a chat about frames, which was introduced in Stata 16.
It was, yep. I believe they may have added a few functions to it in 17, but it was in 16.
Stata is pretty awesome in that it can hold up to 100 different data sets in memory. It is going to depend on how much RAM your computer has got. So don't expect that you'll be able to hold 100 gigabyte files in memory. Stata can hold up to 100 data sets in memory. So if you want to be able to segment those out and link those different data sets, you can, all while it's in memory. And then Stata has this command called frame, and then it allows you to create the frames, manage the frames, switch between the frames, frame get and frame link.
Yeah, so that's sort of similar, well, almost the same really as merging. So traditionally where you might have multiple data files, physical files that you're loading in one at a time to Stata to merge into each other. This is sort of when you're going out wide along a data set. You can now just load all of those data sets into Stata all at once and link them. And the advantage of doing that is that you don't need, you might have 2,000 variables and you only need 1,000 of them. Well, you can have that 2,000 variables split, over multiple ones, and you don't have to have them all merged in together to be able to use them all. You just link them, and it means you can either pull across one variable from one frame to another if you need to, but you can also, if you're just doing a calculation with it and you don't actually really need it in your data set, you can actually do the calculation without ever pulling it in. It's linked. You just reference the link in the calculation that you're performing, and it will do it without you actually having to pull that in.
What I found useful was being able to copy just individual variables over to a new frame or individual observations. So I only wanted a subset of the observations and a subset of the variables. So I just sent that across to my new frame, and I then did my analysis on that new frame rather than the big one.
Yeah, and you can do it with results as well. So if you generate the results of a model or another analysis that you then want to analyze further, you can send that that bit of information into a separate frame, and you can go in and analyze those variables that way.
Yeah, so frames is something that's been really powerful that's been added to Stata. So if you're not using frames, give it a go. I actually used the last webinar that we ran on frames. I actually watched that and went back to the presentation to learn how to use frames with that analysis that I just did. So that was really useful, Laura. Automating your analyses. Now, automating your analyses in Stata it's sort of like the next step. Once you're using Stata and doing a few things in Stata, if you want to start automating your analyses, this is the first really big step. So tell us a little bit about this one and do files to improve your effective and efficient analysis, Laura.
Yeah, so a do file is really, at its very simplest, a text file, which is the list of Stata commands. And if you have it open in Stata's do file editor, you just press the execute command, and it will run all the commands in your file sequentially. So it's really, really useful if you have an analysis that you might run a lot, or you're going to section out bits.
Or if you've got to correct things. Or if you've got to correct mistakes, which I found when I was doing this analysis the other week.
Yeah.
I had a mistake and I had to go back and do the work. So I just copied my history into the do file, fixed the error, and reran it again. And it did it all by itself.
Yeah, so it's really, really useful, but it also has a lot of functions that not many people use. And I think it's really important that we know about them and we start to use them, because they can really speed things up and save you a lot of time. So if you put the effort in at the beginning, you save a lot of time later down the track. And so part of that is setting up the do files to work more broadly. So where normally you would just write a bunch of commands and you would specifically reference particular variables to do something with, you can set the do file up to have basically a placeholder. And so when you run the do file, you give it that placeholder, and it will pop that in all the places that you referenced a particular variable. So it means you can take your analysis from working on one specific data set to being able to work on any data set that is in a similar format. And it's really, really useful if you're doing an analysis multiple times. You're running it across, it might be just a routine thing that you're doing all the time, where variable names might change a little bit. Just being able to do that same thing across multiple places is really, really valuable. And it's also really, really useful for sectioning out your analysis. So if you have a really big analysis that has a whole bunch of, it might be 2,000 lines long, well, that's a very big file, and that's a lot of lines for you to have to go through and try and find if a mistake happens, or try and work out which parts of it you want. And so you can actually nest do files. So you could save that 2,000 line analysis in 5 separate do files, and you can run those 5 separate do files within another master do file. And so that master do file is then referencing each individual do file, and so you've separated it out, and it makes it easier to find errors, and it just separates the analysis out for you if you're trying to edit it or change it later as well. So that's really good as well. And then you're basically able to create automation in the sense that you might always run 5 commands when you're opening a new data set. Well, you can set up a do file so that all you have to do is run one do command, and it will do all of that for you, no matter the data set.
And that's, I think that was probably one of the coolest things that you did in that webinar, was you created a do file which did the same thing on every data set that you opened. So yeah, using the positional arguments and macros.
Yeah.
Now, Stata also has the ability to generate reports, and we touched on that in that automating your analyses webinar. But that's such a big area in its own right. We probably could do a separate webinar just on automated reporting.
Yes, there's a lot of information out there. It's sort of mainly focused on put docs or put PDF, but you're essentially building your report within Stata and then saving it at the end. And I set one of them up to be specific enough that it was analyzing a cancer data set and running a t-test on I believe the number of deaths to work out whether the number of deaths was more in males versus females for this particular candidate. And my report was able to check and apply a different sentence depending on whether it was statistically significant or not. Which is
a nice piece of automation to be able to do. So you haven't had to go back in and do the analysis yourself. You've just had the report, or Stata's done the work for you.
Yeah.
Based on the various conditions. Loops in Stata, they are really important to be able to master, because if you want to automate things, you may have to do something repetitively, and loops are the way that you do it. So a loop performs an action multiple times, changing one thing at a time. So Laura, tell us a bit about the webinar, and what can people expect to see if they register to attend the loops webinar?
Yep, so the loops was really a focus on if you're running a command 5 different times throughout a do file or an analysis, and you're applying the same command 5 different times to 5 different variables, you can really do that in a loop. And it cuts out a lot of the extra lines of code in your do file, which just makes it much easier to find errors. If there's a mistake, you've only written it once, you haven't written it 5 times. You only have to find it once and fix it once, and you're all good. But it runs things a lot faster, and you can control for what it's looping through. So you can loop through a list of variables or a range of numbers, a list of words, literally anything, and it will just go through those that sort of set list one item at a time and apply the commands according to how you've written them. So, a really easy example of that is I want to summarize all the variables in my data set individually. I can create a list of all the variables and then run that in a loop. So rather than having to go summarize A, summarize B, summarize C, I've just put summarize X, and it's done A to Z, looping through the list.
Right. Now, Laura, we mentioned in the previous slide that we could, in the slide on automating your analyses, we mentioned how you could nest do files. So can you have nested do files within a loop? Can I call a do file?
Yep. So if you call a do file in a loop that then has other do files nested within it, yeah, all those do files would have to complete before the loop would finish and start again.
Right. Okay. So it is something that I can do. Good. That I must try that one. So we've got the 2 key types of loops within Stata. There's the for each loop, and that uses a list. So it does a loop for each item in the list. And so your variables, the DS command to get the list of variables and loop through each variable is a good example. And then you've got the for values loop, which works through a range of numbers. The next webinar that we ran, was on creating programs in Stata. Now you've done a little bit of this, Laura. Tell us a little bit about this and why this one's important.
So when you're talking about automation, what we were previously sort of talking about was a specific analysis that you're doing. So you're always sort of getting the same result. When you're looking at creating a Stata program, you're looking more broadly. It's a function that you would use across analyses or across data sets in many different facets of your work within Stata. And this is when you want to start putting it in a Stata program, because you're using it all the time, and having to type it out every single time can become painful and repetitive. And so you pop it in a program, and it means you can just run that program instead. So one example is a program I made for you, David, where you said, I want to create a graph that highlights outliers. So I'll give it a range, and anything outside that range on a scatter plot is highlighted. Yep. And that's something that you might apply across any data set or any analysis. And so it really deserves its own program. And so I created a program that you give it your stated range and your two variables, and it will plot those two variables against each other and highlight the observations that sit outside the range that you gave.
Right.
And so that's when you're sort of really moving into more program territory, when it's something that you're probably going to want to do in a lot of different novel places.
I know I used to work for an organization many years ago, and having your outlabs command that you create, that little program that you created, that would have been very helpful for me with the analysis that I was doing, because I was trying to identify outliers based on certain criteria, and it would have been really good to be able to identify those quickly and easily on the graph. But it turned out it was quite difficult to do. Back in the early 1990s, but having your outlabs, it would have made my work very easy.
So yeah, if there's anything in Stata that you feel you would like it to do something novel, like a particular graph or a particular set of calculations, you can make your own program and have it do that particular application. And sometimes Stata even incorporates those user-written commands into its architecture. So
and
we see really useful.
We see that a lot at the user group meeting. So we see people who have actually developed their own packages to be able to do certain things. And so last year we saw some users that had created a different type of plotting in Stata. And a few years before that, we saw a lady from the Murdoch Children's Research Institute had developed a specific way to create a very specific table that epidemiologists need to create for every report. And so they'd created that in Stata, and it was just ready to go. So then, okay, so that's creating programs. And then the last one that now I must admit, I don't remember this one, Laura, but you tell me we did it, we must have done it.
I think I may have done it, just me. So that might be why you don't remember it.
I don't remember it. Okay.
But this is really just a continuation of the programs. So when you've made your own program, it's a user-written command. It's all done through the command line. But Stata has a whole bunch of programs that are done through the command line and through menus. And you can make your own menu. So that is really what this webinar was about. It was taking you through how to really code, and you do this in a text editor. I usually use Stata's do file editor because that's the easiest. But you create, you code out and you position and you size the box and you create all of the inputs. And so when someone runs that dialog box in Stata, they can go through and make the selections and click OK, and it will then, behind the scenes, it will build the command and run the command that you've written. And you can then attach this to your own menu. So it's really, really useful if you're trying to share a command that you've written with people who maybe don't use Stata commands at all. Maybe they do everything through the menus, or they do most things through the menus. It also makes it really easy to learn if you've got a complex command that you've written, giving someone a dialog box, so all they have to do is pick a few options, can make it really easy to learn how to use as well.
So I guess if you've got a complicated command which has got several different arguments and several different types of arguments and multiple options, creating a dialog box to go with your command is a great way to get it adopted quickly and easily, and making sure that the users of the command are putting the options and arguments in the right spots.
Yeah.
And so that the other thing that I like about Stata on this one is that you can actually create your own menu. So you've got an option there for the user menu, and you can add commands to it and even add other programs to it as well. And perhaps we should run one on how to customize Stata.
We could, yeah. There's a few different ways of customizing it, yeah.
So
incidentally, you can also write your own help file for your commands as well. So this means you can create a command that looks and feels exactly like a Stata command. All the buttons do all the right things.
So Laura, I am going to admit that I had to use the OutLabs help that you created. So when you created that graph for me and created it into a little program, I actually had to use the help function to make sure I was using it correctly. But the help function you'd written was quite good. It looked like a Stata help function, and it worked well for me. So thank you very much for that.
All right.